Welcome to the Behavior and Performance Research Podcast, where we wax poetic about the art of radical health and athlete design. I'm joined by the greatest quote. I'm joined today by the Balagian sensation. Is that the right way to say it? Balayage? Balayage? Balayage.
I know.
The Balayage and
like,
Guatemalan God bless. I'm here with Mar. We're talking about coaching. In this podcast, we're going to break down exactly how to get through conflict with your spouse.
Oh, good.
How to help someone with an alcohol dependency. The secrets to non-judgmental coaching. How to reframe shame, and much more. We'll sell you the whole seat, but for the next few minutes, you're only going to need the edge. Newsflash, 11,000 people watch this channel, but only 10% are actual subscribers. Before we get to the recording, I want to come to you with a direct call to action. I want you to subscribe. We have some things cooked up that are bigger guests, bigger production value, different series that we can only do with the support from people like you. If you like what we're doing, click the subscribe button so that we can give you the information, the content that you deserve. Go ahead and click the subscribe button. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Really, this is for my good friend Boris. Thank you so much for giving me the confidence to be here today.
Yeah. Boris from Australia, the guy that rebranded us, said, "Hey, we need more Marcela." Yeah. I said, "You're not wrong."
No, really, I was thinking to myself that it's probably been exactly a year since we did this.
Yeah.
But really why I thought this would be cool is because it's almost exactly a year from our first full year of offering the Institute. So one full year of getting to coach other coaches, which is just something to celebrate. It's been something we've talked about for years.
Yeah.
And so truly, I'd love to just be here to talk about what that looks like, maybe some tidbits, maybe some pro tips now that, we got a year under us.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm kicking things around. But yeah.
Things we've learned.
Yeah. I've learned a lot.
Yeah, me too. Maybe even things, hey, I thought it was this way, but now after doing things for a year, my ideas have changed around this particular topic in some way.
No, I mean, that's honestly a perfect topic to talk about because even on your last podcast, you talked about being a partner and not essentially, this sounds like very aggressive, but like domineering. Like you don't need to be the dominant presence who knows everything in the coaching space. When instead, I like to use this analogy often, but I'm actually the passenger in their seat of their car with like MapQuest. Like we're old school. I printed out the piece of paper and I know the destination you're driving, so you know the speed, but I'm just the guy giving you directions of like, hey, this would be a good route. This would be a good route. But ultimately, like the client's telling me where to go. Mm-hmm. But that's been something I've actually learned within this last year. A lot of it coming from our conversations with clients of being a better listener. One thing that I've really been working on is, and I mentioned this to you earlier, is when a client technically doesn't succeed at the task at hand, how to do that gracefully where I don't actually make the client feel like a failure, even if it was a goal we set out to do.
Tell me everything. Like, give me, if you can, we'll change the names and the situations, but is anything top of mind as far as like, man, I handled it this way and it seemed like they didn't feel ashamed that they failed, or man, they were actually encouraged that they made this mistake and we figured this thing out?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, I think I've learned a lot about, how to gracefully reframe the way that I tell a client they didn't technically succeed. And a lot of that has come from actually telling kind of like, hey, we said 5, you only got 2. You essentially failed at the task. And they're like, wait, no, like I felt really good about those 2. And like that's such an awkward conversation because in reality, it's their goal. And if they feel successful, well, then that's what's going to motivate them to keep going. And who am I to say that they're technically a failure in their own goal, right? And so that's been something I've learned of even inquiring before I suggest how I feel about their goal. So removing my emotion and my assumption and asking them how they feel. For example, you know, I have a client who's really working on not eating distracted. So like scrolling on their phone. And we talked through what would be a really good strategy. He mentioned that lunchtime is when he finds himself doing it the most often. So we discussed, okay, we for sure need to, you know, frame something around lunchtime. We agreed that, you know, 7 days to start would be a little challenging, but 5s would be perfect. And so we agreed that like, hey, out of 7 days, 5 of those at lunch, we're going to have our phone down and it's going to be uninterrupted. And I followed up. I was like, how did it go? He was like, I did it 2 times. And I think in previous sessions, I would have been like, so you only got 2? Why not 5? And instead, I kind of took a seat and I just said, well, how do you feel about getting those 2? And he was like, I'm stoked. Yeah. And I was like, okay, we're stoked about the 2 times. Tell me more. And again, and I think in previous times, I would have been like, hey, you failed. You only got 2 out of 5. And then that would have made him feel like a failure. And that probably wouldn't have motivated him to continue trying, right?
Yeah.
So instead, it's taking a back seat. It's asking or presenting an observation without emotion. So just saying, hey, I noticed you did it 2 times. How do you feel about that? And letting that sway the next conversation of, he mentioned being excited about the 2 times and being able to inquire of like, cool, how can we get it to 3 times? Was this easy enough? Was it hard enough? And all of the questions that kind of follow along that.
So good. And tying it back to what you said about being a guide versus an expert, it made me think how much pressure I felt in the past where I've basically put myself out there and said like, hey, I know a lot of things about fitness. So if you're coming to me, clearly you want me to be the authority. And so I think that it's so easy in these situations just to reflect back what you said, that when they said 5 and they come in with 2, my own insecurity is like, I failed you because you didn't do what you said, right? And when you realize like, man, it really has nothing to do with you in the first place in this particular thing that we're talking about. It makes you question like, where do your feelings and judgments even have a place in this conversation? What's your opinion on that?
Say it again.
Well, is there so we're making a big distinction that, hey, maybe there's some of us that if we're fitness coaches, if we've been doing this thing for a long time, people are coming onto the gym floor and they do want us to be an expert. They want us to say, hey, you should do 30 pounds instead of 20 pounds. Because in that situation, it won't always make sense to say, well, what do you think you should do, right? There's some expertise. There is more competency and capability because I do have more experience with some of this stuff. So I think on the gym floor, just like if you were going in to see a surgeon, you wouldn't want the surgeon to be like, well, where do you think I should? It's like, hey, you got me.
Yeah.
You're good. And I think when we're in a group session or even a one-on-one session on the training floor and there's exercise to execute, they just want to know that they've outsourced that to you and you've got them. There's such a distinct shift when we start to talk about the rest of their life, when I can't be there as they eat, as they think, as they sleep, as they do anything else in their life. And so the roles do reverse, as you just said. And so I'm wondering, what opinion should I even have about any of that stuff, right? Because if we're on the gym floor and they don't get low enough, it's totally okay for me to say, hey, give me 2 more inches. That's not my opinion. That's just an objective fact.
Yeah.
The stuff that you're talking about, hey, give me 5 times versus 2. That's such a narrow scope of everything that happened, right? How he feels about it, what was going on, what resulted in that would allow some momentum to happen forward for future habits. And so I guess the question I'm trying to back into is, do our opinions matter when we're talking about coaching the rest of their life?
No.
It's a good question, right? Because I think and I'm just kind of riffing, right? We can get back on track. I think on one side, there's this expert consultant thing that, some of us are in fitness, but when we're talking about this, we're definitely not. But if you go all the way to the extreme of that, it's to say, I'm only a therapeutic listener. And so I think it's somewhere definitely closer to this side. It's somewhere definitely closer to, hey, you have the answers and I'm really just here to listen and redirect you. But I find it valuable to have someone's observation as a part of the equation, because I get so wrapped up in my own head of feeling ashamed, of feeling not good enough, of telling myself this whole elaborate story, that when someone that I trust hears that and they say, that's not what I think, I find it really helpful. It can redirect me and it can get me out of my funk. Now, that's not what I think is different than, oh, well, you should have done 5 times, right? There's no shoulds in there. But I think some feedback can be helpful at times. Agree or disagree?
No, I for sure would agree with that.
I know I felt myself going on a tangent there.
No, that's perfect. No, yeah, for sure. It would be different if I sat in a coaching session and every single time I met with him, he was like, 2 times, I still feel good about it. Then at some point I would probably say, hey, is this even really important to you if you're content with 2 times? Or, hey, is this already, we mentioned the goal would be one day to never eat undistracted, but you're content with 2 times. Is that where we should just end it here? And by asking enough questions to get there. Mm-hmm. But it would be inappropriate for me to just sit here and listen to him every single week say the same thing over and over and over again. Because then what am I really doing? So at some point, there has to be some feedback in direction. I think just the way as a coach that you approach that can either make or break the client's desire to keep pushing. For example, it's I don't know if you experience this one at home, but the difference between you do the dishes versus, hey, Spencer, do you mind doing the dishes? Right? One of them's hey, I don't know about you. If someone's do this, I'm going to do the opposite. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Versus if someone asks me or makes a request of me, I'm okay, yeah, maybe. Oh, I can do it. Okay, fine. I can do the dishes, right? Mm-hmm. And I think at some point with clients, in giving your opinion is like that. It is not you should do this, but maybe asking the right questions that they stumble upon. Okay, this is something I should be doing.
Mm-hmm. I think I still have some room to grow there. And I've found myself in conversations where we're not talking about fitness, and I can find myself slipping back into the let me give advice role, or let me educate you a little bit. And I don't think that will ever be completely eliminated, because how could we learn? How could we grow? But I am finding, maybe in this last year especially, that what amount I thought was necessary is really significantly less. Mm-hmm. And there is, and not in a condescending way, because I think a lot of this stuff can come off condescending. Well, what do you think about that, right? Mm-hmm. It's nothing like that, but it is getting so good at bringing attention to things, right? Because you can bring attention to something without giving your opinion. It's just making some observations. Wow, when you said that, your rate of speech got a lot quicker. Not even saying, so you must be frustrated. Just be hey, did you notice that, you got really excited when you started talking about that? What's that all about, right? That's that's an observation without saying, oh, you must really love that.
Well, it goes back to what you mentioned of like, hey, things on the gym floor are way easier to like coach because it's an observation and you just say it like, hey, you didn't get low enough. And that, what you just said of like, hey, you got really excited. Like it's an observation. Like there's no emotion attached to that. So it's easy to say like, hey, you know, you got 2 times without adding in like, you only got 2 times. Like you only got this height. It was like, hey, you didn't get low enough. So I think it's the difference between coaching the observation versus like coaching the emotion.
Do you think that you can separate those in health coaching?
That's a good question.
Do you think you could have a tight enough relationship with someone, worked with them for a long time, so in the same way we say, hey, you weren't low enough in the air squat, they don't attach that to shame, right? Or it's like, oh, I'm such a piece of crap. They're like, okay, copy that. Like, yeah, I didn't get low enough. Do you think there's the possibility to get to that place with this other stuff?
I feel like you can.
Yeah, I mean,
in the right relationship.
Yeah,
I guess.
Well, how do you go about when those are really attached, right? Even if you're just making an observation, and you can tell, man, this person's really hard on themselves. I just said, hey, we had 2 uninterrupted meals this week. And instead of saying, oh man, isn't that awesome? They're like, I'm such a pile. How do you go about redirecting failure? How do you go about detaching them from a lot of the emotions, a lot of the self-talk that goes with the inevitable course of making mistakes as we're designing new habits?
I feel like the first step is usually to try to detach the emotion. It is, you know, again, I mentioned like the no shame reframe, but it is reframing their own words. A lot of the times, if a client's like, no, I'm a pile, I want to circle back to what was accomplished versus letting the emotion, you know, dwindle on or continue on and being like, no, you're not, carry on, you know. I want them to reframe even the way that they just spoke out loud to, I mean, essentially what the next task at hand would be of like, hey, aren't you mentioned 2 out of 5. That's 2 meals closer than you were last week. So instead of thinking like, hey, you suck, why don't we just say like, hey, how cool? And in their own words, have them rewrite that without the emotion, create space from it, and try it again.
Can we role play?
Okay. I'm going to try my best.
Okay. You tell me, and I'm going to not over-exaggerate. I'm going to really try to just be, like, for real. What should be the thing that we're talking about? Should it just be real?
It can be.
Okay.
I hope I do a good job.
Okay, so here's the scene. You and I have previously discussed, and I came up with this, that I would only have 1 night of drinking a week. And so you're following up with me, just seeing how that went. And it's not going to go very well.
Hey, Spencer, you 10 years sober guy.
Oh, no, don't say that. Don't say that. No.
Just kidding. Hey, Spence.
Hey, what's up?
You mentioned to me last week that your goal was to have 1 alcoholic drink. How did it go?
Didn't go well. I had multiple days this week where I had the choice to not drink, and I chose to drink. And as I look back more, it wasn't even like big celebrations. I just like wasn't even thinking. I was in a social situation here. I was taking clients to dinner here. They asked if I wanted to drink, and I just, you know, I ended up with this thing in my hand, and I'm embarrassed to say that to you. I feel I feel ashamed that I told you I would do one thing and I did another. And so to me it feels like a complete miss. It feels like not only did I fail, but it's like I'm a failure, just to be honest.
Couple of things I heard were, hey, we didn't successfully complete the one. I also heard that a lot of this was out of people pleasing. So it's something I want to touch on, but we don't have to talk about it right now. But you mentioned the words like, hey, I had multiple. Let's add some color to that. What did that really look like?
Well, it was actually just one. It was just a drink, but it was 3 different times. So there's that. It wasn't 20. I didn't get blackout drunk, but it was a drink on 3 different occasions. More than we talked about. More than just Saturday.
So in total, you had 3 drinks this week. Did I hear that correctly?
That is correct.
More last conversation, Spencer. You were getting blacked out 2 to 3 times per week. So the fact that we had 3 drinks, I would actually say is a big shift from where it used to be. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. When you say it like that, it's actually a pretty big difference.
Now you mentioned the 3 drinks. You mentioned not being, extremely excited on how that turned out. And like I mentioned, we talked a little bit about it sounds like many of those times were because of your environments. Let's talk about that.
Well, I mean, 2 of them were planned. Like I knew I was going into this, but I told myself like that I'm sure I'd be fine when I got there, and I wouldn't have to drink. But then just when it happened, I think that you're right. Like there was a little need to fit in. There was a little bit of a need to, just not want somebody to ask why I wasn't drinking since they were. But the other time, it really was like before I even knew it, I had, like a drink in my hand. So yeah, I think that socially, that seemed to have a big part of it. The time where I didn't know what was going on, it's not like I was a robot, but I was just so involved in the game that I was watching that it just, it's like, yeah, somebody put a beer in my hand and then, we were enjoying ourselves. So I think you may be right. I think there may be something there where if I find myself already in this situation, it's going to be very challenging for me to have the willpower in that scenario.
Well, give me some insight on the days that you did do well. What were the thoughts, the behaviors, the actions that happened for you to be successful on those days?
Well, I wasn't in a bar. That much is true. There wasn't a restaurant with alcohol. There was no problem the nights I was at home. When I was outside for most of the day on Saturday, it didn't even feel like a temptation or something that I was drawn to in the evening. People I'm super close to, it didn't feel like there was any pressure to drink around them. It was really just like a certain type of surface level relationship, or those that I just didn't really want to have any type of like confrontation with. So it was just easier to just put the drink in my hand versus not. So yeah, it seems like there's lots of situations where there isn't as strong of a draw. Yeah.
Well, we mentioned the 3 times, and that actually was successful outside of the many times that you used to get blacked out. Moving forward, now that we've noticed, like, hey, I had 3, what would be a good next step? Like, are you trying to go down in frequency at all? Or do we want to still shoot for that one drink that we mentioned being important to you?
You know what? Since just talking, I wonder if the environment has more to do with how I feel, and that has more to do with the choices that I make. So I wonder if you may need to help me out here, but is there something that we can do where it's like, hey, I just prioritize the people I'm with, maybe the environment I'm at. I don't know if I can completely avoid client dinners or, being in a restaurant with alcohol, But I wonder if instead of just being like, hey, you've got to like not drink, I wonder if I could maybe focus on something that I know is related to that. It's almost like the emotions that are attached to it. Maybe that's something.
Yeah. Well, I was going to mention one, the environments, but two, you mentioned every single time it was just having something in your hand. And so I was going to ask, like, how could we fill that something in your hand?
Like chicken nuggets. Yeah.
Better decision. Only if you start with keeping it in your pocket.
What do you mean? Like not having something in my hand?
No, you mentioned on all occasions, like, I, had a drink in my hand at this client dinner. I was watching a football game, and next thing you know, I had something in my hand.
I feel like it's my shield, that I'm socially anxious, and it's my protection. So I don't know how to do that without it. Could I just have like something that looks like alcohol, but it's not really alcohol?
I think that's great. What do you think?
I don't just get like drunk on like Topo Chicos.
I love that. I'm a Diet Coke gal personally, but yeah.
Do they think that when you drink it, it's like
Jack and Coke,
Jack and Coke?
Yeah.
And scene, was that good? I really felt like I was drinking again while we were I was like transported back to when that was exactly my life. You did a good job. Just to give you some real-time feedback, I know we were just playing pretend and role-playing, but I can see how highlighting the good versus the bad, dreaming ahead of time what might success look like, and then just continually affirming like what I did well versus like focusing on the bad. That was all make-believe, and I felt good. I felt like I can go out and do this. I can figure this out.
Well, and I love this format because, I refuse to coach husbands, Spencer. You can't. We've talked about this on other pods. Like, you can't coach your spouses. But this type of reframing I've found works not just with clients. It works with the way I communicate with my husband. Like I mentioned, instead of being like, yo, do the dishes, Spencer, it's a, hey, would you please? And that typically goes over a lot better.
It's funny you mention that, because I know that we've said and we've heard, hey, you can't coach family, but yet it is necessary to share how you feel. It is necessary to have this balanced give and take of, I need to hear what's important to you, and I also need to share what's important to me. And it would be really nice if you didn't get defensive when I shared how I was feeling, and vice versa. And so in a lot of ways that is coaching, right? It's different in that your spouse isn't paying you to just ask great questions, which means that your feelings are really important. And so I've been wrestling with that. I know that's not what we were here to talk about, but I wonder, just like you said, what strategies have been really effective with a spouse? And I'll go first. I think it's very easy to get defensive with the person that sees all your shit, right? Somebody says something to me on the street, it's like, you don't know me, but Kelly knows me. And so I can see myself wanting to deflect, wanting to retreat, wanting to belittle, and wanting to get defensive. But I have one trick that's been very helpful, that whatever she's saying, and this is going to sound so childish, but I just echo whatever it is I think that she is emoting. Because a lot of times, just like nonviolent communication, we're already jumping to the thing that we're thinking, but there's typically a feeling behind the thing, right? Hey, I wanted you to unload the dishwasher. That's a thought, but there's an emotion that precedes that. And so even just trying to guess, is what you're feeling frustrated? Are you frustrated that I didn't do the dishwasher? And sometimes she'll be like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm feeling. It's like, well, I'm appreciative that you shared that. And 9 times out of 10, that like completely diffuses it. She's like, yeah. And then, situation's over. But a lot of times she'll be like, no, I'm not feeling frustrated. I'm feeling, and then she'll replace it with whatever is the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in both times, it gives me, it's almost like I'm stealing a little bit of time because I'm fired up from whatever she said. And so it's like, are you feeling this? And then by the time she responds, I've like calmed down where I don't need to deflect, retreat, belittle, or get defensive. And I think that I've learned that from coaching.
Mm-hmm.
I think like just being super calm, because there's times even when somebody says something, because we're human beings, we do have bias, right? We do want to be like, hey man, you shouldn't have done that,
Yeah.
Which is just so unhelpful. So I'm wondering if, in your tenure as a married woman, if you've also, you mentioned something before, but any other insights there, or any ways it's like, you know what, this is a better way to talk to somebody that I'm equally, yoked with.
Oh, I mean, I think the biggest thing I've learned in coaching that has translated into marriage and even just really any relationship has been assumptions.
Mm.
Like getting enough information before I come to a conclusion. Like, back to the dishwasher example.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Spencer, can you please, unload the dishwasher? And if it's not unloaded, my knee jerk is to be like, he doesn't love me.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he did, he would have unloaded the
Mm-hmm.
dishwasher.
Mm-hmm.
And I can move along my day believing he does not love me, because if he did, he would have. When I'm curious if this happened in your household, more often than not, it's not that he didn't love me or that he didn't care or that the request I made was dumb. Something might have happened along the way. Like, nothing's more unfortunate than being like, you didn't do this, you love me. And it's like, oh, sorry, my mom called. I was like, oh, I'm like so glad you got to talk to your mom. My bad. Like, hey, do you mind doing it another time? So I mentioned that because I think coaching has really caused me to make sure before I make any assumptions about anything is to come in with inquiry. And same scenario I keep mentioning of like making sure that, if he did unload the dishwasher, but it wasn't, or load it, and it wasn't how I would do it, that I'm not like, hey, that sucked, and him thinking in his head like he just did something great.
Mm-hmm.
And so asking like, hey, I noticed you did this. How'd it go? And if he's like, it went really well, then I know like, hey, he did his best, which is him loving me well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if anything, it's really the practice of coming in with inquiry and no assumption has been the most fruitful thing for me.
Which is easier when it's a client, because it's like, well, for sure, I don't know everything that they have going on.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot harder when it's your spouse, because it's like, well, we were together all day long. So, like how could you not be exactly in sync with what I'm thinking?
Mm-hmm.
But it's so untrue, right? And it's so unfair to think, hey, because this person lives with you, how self-centered does this sound? They're paying attention to my every movement and word and thought. It's like, that's not true. Like, imagine this scenario where, I think anybody could imagine this. We'll say Spencer has, because this is even funnier. Spencer has made like this amazing dinner, right? And he's waiting for you as you get home. A lot of that's funny because Mars' day starts at 3:30, so that means her day ends a lot sooner. So she would not be the one coming home within the day. But anyway, so I digress. And when you come in, he's got candles lit, and it's like a nice spread. And you're like, hey, I'm going to go take a shower. Now, if you were just watching that movie, you would be like, oh my gosh, Marcela is so insensitive. But if part of the movie was showing that, a loved one had just like passed away, and you couldn't even get up the emotion to like say that to them, it's a completely different story. And so without that information, it's easy when you just see that one scene to be like, oh, well, she's just so insensitive. But it's just really hard to ever assume that you have all the information. Mm-hmm. Well, back to coaching. What else? What other insights do you feel like you've gained different ways in the last year, especially as we step outside of 12, 13 Washington to coach other coaches where you think, you know what, I once thought this, but now my perspective is a little bit different because of the experience I've had? Anything come to mind?
You know, the first thing that comes to my mind is I think as coaches, we tend to think, they know what I'm thinking. They know why I'm asking these questions. Even other coaches, know what I mean. And what I mean by this is things that are super novel in these four walls. Things in these four walls that are not super novel that we have these conversations about, making no assumptions, non-violent verbal communication, like things like that. Things that we're like, yeah, we do that all the time. I find myself more often than not speaking to other coaches, different places, and finding that these are new and novel concepts, which is why it's so cool to sit here and talk about this in hopes that conversations like this really help people wanting to further that.
To us, it feels very normal. What are some novel things that you wish people knew? It's like, man, if you could give one or two or, even three things, like to the coach that's listening to this, hey, here's just a few things that have completely changed the way that I interact with people. A few good rules of thumbs when I'm going into a new client. I mean, you said a lot of them, but I'm just wanting to squeeze all the water out of the rag here.
Like I mentioned, I think number one is like no assumptions. Go in and try to learn the most about a client possible. Number two, it's not that your client is not competent. It's that we're probably playing the wrong play. And what I mean by that is I always love to use the analogy of like getting ready for a really big football game. Like getting the information without assumption is like watching game tape. Like you get to watch your client's life. You get to see, hey, when this route is run, they go to the left. When this route is run, they go to the right. You figure out which plays are really slow at, which plays are really good at already. And your job is to essentially guide them into new routes and teach them new plays and coach them through new drills that would make them efficiently play the game better. So that they have all these new routes to go play the game of life better. Mm-hmm. So along with like getting the most information, it's the second. It's like your client isn't dumb. It's just that they might be running the wrong route for the wrong play. And so you just need to find a new route to play the game better.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really good. Were you going to say something else?
No, those are like the main two I can think of, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then when they fail, which they inevitably will, there isn't a necessity to beat yourself up about it. Along those same lines, it's like, man, it wasn't that you were trying any lesser on this one play. Like this just wasn't the right package. Mm-hmm. Is that the right term for football? This wasn't the right. Yeah, it wasn't the right package for.
It wasn't the right play. Yeah. Well, I mean, in
package.
That we love the NFL. Watch Receivers on Netflix. Go Boys.
Have you watched that on Netflix?
I've seen a little bit of it.
I just watched the first one. I'm sure you watched the same thing. That the tight end from the 49ers is kind of crazy. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. The only white guy they feature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our only hope. Our only hope. We're real proud of him. It's a smart receiver. Tough. What does Shane Gillis say? It's a smart route.
Good. Yes. Keep quoting Shane Gillis.
What else should we talk about before we go?
Well, back to the route conversation.
Back to sports?
Back to sports.
Uh-huh.
Go sports. What I was just going to say about running the right routes, and this not just being a training floor setting or, coaching one-on-one through health and wellness. But I always think about times where we've had employees in the wrong role. It's like, hey, they weren't a dumb person or not good at their job. They just weren't in the right role. Kids, nighttime routines. It's not that your kid is dumb or lazy or, sucks. It's that, hey, maybe the nighttime routine that you're trying isn't working for them. So I think about this setting in just multiple areas of life of how that can play out of, again, it's not always that the person is, again, dumb, incompetent, whatever. It's that whatever strategy or place or environment they're in is just like not the most successful one.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And even kids' sports too. You're like, oh man, this kid's not athletic. It's like, no, at this particular age, with this particular sport, at this particular time of day, at this particular time of the year, you're not seeing them shine. But it's like to make these gross assumptions, I think can be applied in lots of different contexts. It honestly has nothing to do with fitness. It's just something that's so necessary for us to, as the Stoics say, like find the flow of life. You can't have that without health. You can't have it without fitness. And so obviously that's something that we're very interested in, and it's what primarily our coaching is about. But yeah, this thing we're talking about and what you did to me, I would say, agree or disagree. A lot of that is appreciative inquiry, right? It's redirecting where, just like we were saying, all my attention is, and be like, no. What's happened? There's good stuff. What's going on right now? There's good stuff. What we could potentially dream up, there's lots of good stuff. And that seems so Pollyanna, or like so manically optimistic that it doesn't work. But the little example that we gave, I think, could be applied in lots of different contexts at work. It's like, hey, you said you totally botched this project, but did you? The whole thing was terrible? Everything went to crap. No? What went well? Like, what can you really be appreciative of? What I hear you saying is that actually you're really competent at this, and this. Moving forward, knowing what you're competent at, what could this look like from, a sales standpoint, from a retention standpoint, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, to answer your question, Caleb, I think that you could take all of this and just reduce it down to people don't need your opinion in the way that you think that they need it quite as often as you think that they need it. What they need is somebody pulling the good stuff out of you that you already had in, that you just decided was total crap. And I think whether it's sports, fitness, in the church, probably we could have a whole conversation about that, where a lot of, so much of that is focused on what the problem is, right? So much of it is focused on like, what's the sin struggle? What's the thing you're doing that like we need to clean up, versus like, look at all the great stuff you're doing. Look at all of the fruit, to use Christianese. Look at all the fruit that you're bearing and all the things that you're doing. So I think the applications are almost infinitely applicable. Yeah. It's cool that you can constantly be practicing it too. I never thought growing up that I would like talking. But when I think about it, it's like, it's not really me talking, but I'm like just so fascinated to listen. And this has given me, when I do have to open my mouth, such like a newfound appreciation for doing it well. And I think for a long time, I thought doing it well was saying like these magical words, like being like a Sherlock Holmes, and, just almost like a godlike figure, be like, oh, so it's about your relationship with your mother. It's like, it's not really what it is, but it's just like almost like forgetting that you're even a part of what's going on. I don't know. I don't know if that comes across the right way or not.
That's why I love coaching.
Yeah.
I love not being the expert.
Oh, it's so nice. It's like such a
stress relief.
Oh my God.
Like the pressure.
Oh,
you think you need, you don't.
Yeah.
You don't.
I think the hardest part is just like shutting your mouth and just being cool just to sit there. I've thought about that a lot. It's like, I want to just be able to like look into someone's eyes without words being spoken. And I feel like even I have room to grow with that. Just, sitting there, legs crossed, long white hair, no shirt, on short turfed grass in Malibu outside of an Airstream trailer, just staring into
Coachland.
Yes. Staring into your eyes. Well, Mar, thanks for your wisdom. Thanks for your coaching.
having me.
If I had a alcohol problem, I feel like, man, that'd be a great step in the right direction. Yeah.
Thanks for having me in this space to talk about your non-existing addiction.
Yeah. Well, just one that's in maintenance, the maintenance phase.
The maintenance phase.
Subscribe!